It was a dark, stormy Thanksgiving evening, the kind of rain that seemed alive, battering the windows like restless fingers trying to find a way inside. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the otherwise cozy warmth of our small family gathering. Our Thanksgivings were never huge, just my mom, my sisters Nancy and Jamie, our grandparents, and me. This year was no different, or so we thought. The day had started as a typical holiday. The kitchen buzzed with activity, the scent of roasted turkey and freshly baked cornbread filling the air. The weather outside was dreadful, but it made the indoors feel all the more comforting, a sanctuary from the storm. Our grandparents arrived around 5 o'clock, struggling through the torrential downpour. My mom sent Jamie and me out to help them up the slippery steps. By the time we got them inside, all of us were drenched. Grandpa, a die-hard Cowboys fan, made a beeline for the living room where the game was on. I joined him while my mom, Nancy, and Jamie continued their work in the kitchen. The storm outside raged on, a relentless backdrop to our cozy gathering. At 6 o'clock sharp, as always, dinner was served. The table was laden with an impressive spread turkey, lamb, potatoes, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and more than we could possibly eat. We laughed, shared stories, and toasted with wine. It was a picture-perfect Thanksgiving. Until the doorbell rang. The chime cut through the air like a knife, startling us all. My mom frowned, exchanging a worried glance with my grandmother. "Who could that be in this weather?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. My grandmother, always the optimist, suggested it might be a neighbor in need. My mom, more cautious, muttered, "Or your father." Her voice trailed off. My parents had been estranged for years, but the idea of my dad showing up unannounced wasn't entirely far-fetched. "Go check," my mom said, motioning to me. I made my way to the door, the sound of rain pounding on the awning almost deafening. "Who is it?" I shouted through the door. A muffled male voice responded, but the storm swallowed his words. I cracked the door open, leaving the storm door locked between us. Standing on the porch was a man cloaked in an oversized rain jacket, his hood pulled low over his face. The dim porch light revealed little, but his voice was desperate as he shouted over the storm. "I'm hungry. Please, can you spare some food?" His words caught me off guard. It wasn't uncommon for strangers to ask for help, but his presence in the middle of a storm like this felt off. I told him to wait and went to inform my mom. "There's a man at the door," I said. "Says he's hungry and asking for food." My mom's face hardened. "Close the door. You don't know who he is." But my grandmother, ever compassionate, said, "Give him some food. It's Thanksgiving after all." I hesitated but decided to put together a plate. I grabbed a stack of paper plates and piled some leftovers onto one of them. As I returned to the door, the man hadn't moved. I held up the plate to show him through the glass, but then he did something unexpected. He grabbed the storm door handle and tried to open it. "Wait!" I shouted. The door was locked, but my gut tightened. Something wasn't right. Still, against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. The moment the latch clicked, he yanked it open with shocking force, shoving his way forward. The plate of food flew from my hands as I braced against him, yelling for help. Nancy came running, and together we managed to slam the door shut just as two more figures emerged from the shadows, sprinting up the walkway. My heart pounded as I locked the door, barely processing what had just happened. "Back door!" I yelled, bolting through the house to make sure it was secure. My mum was on the phone with the police, her voice shaking as she described what had happened. Through the rain-streaked windows, I saw the two other men running across the backyard, their dark figures barely visible in the downpour. They tugged at the back door, but it held firm. Frustrated, they turned and disappeared into the night. When the police arrived, the food I'd dropped was still scattered on the porch. It was clear those men hadn't come for a meal. They'd come for something else, something far more sinister. The officers scoured the property, asking questions and looking for signs of the men, but the storm had washed away any evidence. They promised to patrol the area, but admitted there wasn't much they could do. That Thanksgiving night could have ended in tragedy. If we hadn't acted quickly, who knows what those men might have done. The rain, once a cozy backdrop to our holiday, now seemed oppressive and menacing like a harbinger of danger. In the days that followed, we installed a doorbell camera and reinforced the locks on every door. The memory of that night has stayed with me, a chilling reminder that even the simplest acts of kindness can sometimes invite darkness. The night was heavy with an unsettling quiet, a silence that wrapped around the house like a warning. Thanksgiving had always been a time of warmth and family for Melissa, a refuge from the chaos of everyday life. But this year something darker loomed, a shadow creeping closer that would shatter her sense of safety. Melissa had driven to her parents' home for Thanksgiving dinner. It was a lively gathering, full of familiar faces and the comforting smells of turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. Laughter echoed through the house as family members caught up after a long year apart. She should have felt safe here, surrounded by love and light. Yet an ominous pit had settled in her stomach, a feeling she couldn't shake. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from the warmth of the living room. She excused herself and glanced at the screen. The message was long, an essay from an unknown number. Her pulse quickened as she read the opening words. "Hey Melissa, hope your Thanksgiving is going well." Her breath hitched as recognition washed over her. It was him. Kevin, the man who had turned her life into a waking nightmare. They had matched on a dating app months ago, exchanged a few casual messages, but his interest had quickly spiraled into obsession. When Melissa gently declined his invitation for a date, he had reacted with hostility, his texts turning threatening. She blocked him on every platform, but Kevin was persistent. Fake accounts, anonymous messages, constant attempts to reach her. He seemed to revel in his ability to invade her life. Now, on a night meant for gratitude and peace, he had found her again. The message was disturbingly personal, filled with details only someone watching her could know. Her fingers trembled as she typed a response. "Stop contacting me or I'll go to the police." She hit send, hoping her firm tone would finally end this nightmare. But Kevin didn't know how to take no for an answer. Dinner continued, and Melissa did her best to engage in conversations and enjoy the night. But the unease lingered like a shadow. Half an hour later, her phone buzzed again. Another text from another unknown number. The message was longer, angrier. His words dripped with venom, accusing her of leading him on, berating her for rejecting him. Melissa's heart raced as she showed the texts to her family. Her mother's face darkened with concern, and her father clenched his jaw. They urged her to report Kevin to the police the next day. She nodded, but a gnawing fear whispered in her mind. What if tomorrow is too late? Later that night, Melissa returned to her apartment. She shared the lower floor of a two-family house with her roommate Chelsea, who was spending Thanksgiving with her own family. The upstairs tenants were quiet and rarely home, leaving Melissa feeling isolated. She locked the door behind her, double-checking the deadbolt. The air inside was still, the silence almost deafening. Melissa tried to shake off the tension as she changed into pajamas and settled into bed. She put on a light-hearted Christmas movie, hoping the cheerful scenes would drown out the dark thoughts swirling in her mind. But just as her eyelids grew heavy, a noise snapped her awake. Footsteps. They were faint but deliberate, moving through the apartment. Melissa froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Chelsea must be home, she thought, though the unease in her gut said otherwise. The footsteps grew louder, approaching her bedroom door. The doorknob rattled. Melissa bolted upright. "Chelsea," she called out, her voice trembling. The rattling stopped. Silence. She grabbed her phone, her fingers shaking as she dialed Chelsea's number. No answer. A text notification lit up her screen. It was from another unknown number. "Good thing you made it obvious where you live." Melissa's blood ran cold. She called her father, whispering into the phone that someone was in the house. Her father's voice was sharp with urgency. Stay put. I'm on my way. The next 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Melissa stayed on the line with her father, clutching a kitchen knife she had grabbed from her nightstand. Her breathing was shallow, her ears straining to catch any sound beyond her pounding heartbeat. When her phone vibrated again, she jumped. Chelsea was calling back. "I'm not coming home tonight," Chelsea said. Melissa's stomach dropped. Whoever was in the apartment, it wasn't her roommate. When her father arrived, Melissa rushed to unlock the front door. He stepped inside, his face etched with worry. They searched the apartment together, turning over every room. At first, it seemed empty, until her father found the kitchen window. It was open. The icy November air seeped into the room as Melissa stared in disbelief. She never locked the window, a habit she now regretted deeply. Her father's disappointment cut through her fear as he lectured her on basic safety. But the thought that chilled her most was that Kevin, or someone working with him, had been inside her home. The next morning, Melissa and her father went to the courthouse to file for a restraining order. The process was grueling, and Melissa's fear intensified when she realized she would have to face Kevin in court. When the day came, her breath caught as she saw him for the first time. Kevin was unremarkable, an average-looking man whose presence felt anything but ordinary. His gaze was cold, calculating, and it lingered on her just a second too long. The judge granted the restraining order, extending its terms due to the threatening messages and Melissa's testimony. She hoped it would be enough to keep him away. But the haunting reality remained. Someone willing to cross boundaries so boldly might not be deterred by a piece of paper. Melissa moved out of the apartment shortly after the incident, relocating to a more secure building with tighter locks and a robust security system. Though Kevin's texts stopped, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow felt like a threat, every unexpected noise a potential danger. To this day, Melissa sleeps with her windows locked and her bedroom door bolted shut. She hasn't heard from Kevin again, but she knows that his kind of obsession doesn't just disappear. Somewhere out there in the vast, unpredictable world, he's still lurking, waiting. Thanksgiving night. It was supposed to be a time of joy, family, and togetherness. But for my family, that night would end in terror, leaving us all shaken and forever questioning who or what was out there, lurking in the dark. It all began like a normal holiday gathering. Most of my relatives live in a rural part of central Florida, near the East Coast. My Uncle Ben, a true Floridian at heart, was hosting Thanksgiving at his place that year. His house sat on a massive, secluded lake surrounded by only a handful of other homes, tucked away from the main road. The setting was rustic, nothing fancy, but private and spacious. It was the kind of place that could make you feel both at peace and unnerved all at once. But that night, it would be the place of nightmares. Uncle Ben, known for his laid-back and wild nature, was always the life of the party. He'd decided to go all out for this Thanksgiving. No typical dinner with formalities here. Instead, it was like a celebration, complete with music, cornhole, coolers of beer, and all the things that made family gatherings unforgettable. We arrived around 3 p.m., the sun still high in the sky. The air was warm, the sounds of laughter filled the air, and the drinks flowed freely as we spent hours playing games, card games, cornhole, even basketball with my cousin. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange unease settled in. Around 5:30 p.m., Aunt Mel and Uncle Ben began bringing out the food. The table was set up under the large gazebo by the lake, surrounded by trees and darkness. It was picturesque, but there was an ominous feeling in the air. The lights around the gazebo flickered on as the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard. By 6 p.m. it was completely pitch black, and the only light came from the lamps around the gazebo and the faint glow of the moon above the lake. Despite the chill creeping up my spine, we all sat down to eat. the usual laughter and conversation filling the air. Everything seemed normal, that is, until my cousin pointed behind me. "Dad, who's that?" she asked, her voice shaking. I turned around, following her finger toward the woods. At first I thought it was just someone walking by, maybe a neighbor. But as my eyes focused on the figure, I realized it was far too still, standing motionless in the dark, like a shadow among the trees. Uncle Ben stood up quickly. "Who the hell's that?" he shouted. He began walking toward the figure, his steps sure, but his tone a little too casual for the situation. "Can I help you with something?" he called out. We all watched as Uncle Ben marched into the darkness, but before he could get close, the figure turned around and bolted into the woods, disappearing without a trace. Uncle Ben returned to the table, laughing. "Must be one of the local nuts," he said, slapping his knee, clearly not understanding the gravity of the situation. But Aunt Mel wasn't laughing. She shot him a look that spoke volumes of her concern. "That was creepy," she muttered. I agreed with her. Something about the way the figure had just stood there, unmoving, watching us, made my skin crawl. But the moment passed, and we tried to brush it off. My dad made a joke about how the men at the table could take care of anything. We tried to continue eating, but the unease lingered in the back of my mind. Then, it happened again. I spotted the figure once more, but this time it was standing much closer to the lake. I pointed it out to everyone, and Uncle Ben, clearly getting agitated, stood up again. "Not again," he muttered, making his way toward the figure. But as he walked, something worse happened. Another figure emerged from the opposite side of the yard, standing eerily still in the trees. We watched in disbelief as Uncle Ben shouted at the first figure, who immediately ran back into the woods, but the second one didn't move, staying exactly where he stood. Panic began to set in. "Dad, there's another one," I said, my voice trembling. My cousin, Dad, and I all stood up now, ready to confront whoever was out there. But as we made our way toward the figures, the second one bolted into the trees as well. At that point, we decided it was time to call it a night. We hurriedly packed up the table and brought the food inside. The tension in the air was thick, and everyone was on edge. Uncle Ben, normally the type to shrug things off, seemed uncharacteristically serious. He left the lights on outside, and Aunt Mel, now visibly nervous, started shutting the curtains. Something didn't feel right. We could all sense it. I was the first to get up, deciding to grab another beer from the cooler outside. Uncle Ben and my dad asked me to grab one for them too, so I reluctantly stepped outside. The once cheerful atmosphere of the gathering had shifted, and now the house felt like a fortress. As I walked toward the gazebo, a cold shiver ran down my spine. The light around the gazebo was off now, and the air felt unnaturally still. My heart started to race as I grabbed a few beers, just so I could get back inside quickly. That's when I heard it. A chair under the gazebo scraped across the concrete. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There, standing under the gazebo, was someone, tall, too tall to be any of my relatives. He was walking around the table, slowly, deliberately. I couldn't breathe. "Uncle Ben!" I shouted as I turned and ran back toward the house. Uncle Ben and my dad came rushing out. "What's going on?" my dad asked. "There's a guy over there," I said, panic rising in my voice. As if on cue, a loud bang echoed from the other side of the house, followed by a thud, like someone was slamming their hand against the siding. That's when it hit us. We weren't alone. My uncle and dad exchanged a look, and without saying another word, they locked the door behind us. The house felt like a prison now, the windows tightly shut, the blinds drawn. Aunt Mel frantically checked every window, her hands shaking as she pulled the curtains closed. For the first time, Uncle Ben dialed the police. Hearing him, The man who'd always been so tough and self-reliant called the police, made everything feel real. Something was very wrong. We waited in the living room, the tension unbearable, the silence pressing in. And then, a sudden loud bang. A brick was thrown through the kitchen window, crashing against the glass. My heart stopped. A note was attached to the brick. It was simple. "Leave now, you." A chill swept over the room. The message was clear, but it didn't end there. The next morning, we discovered that Uncle Ben's Trump flag was missing. Was this political, or was it just the work of sick, twisted people who took pleasure in terrorizing others? There were more questions than answers. All we knew was this: someone was out there, watching us, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But the most unsettling thought was the one we couldn't shake. What if they were still out there, watching, waiting, for the next moment to strike? We may never know who they were, or why they targeted us. But that night, we learned that some horrors come quietly, creeping in like shadows, and you never know when they'll reach out and touch you.